Torture Mom, a chilling true story of confinement, mutilation, and murder, Indianapolis, July 1965. A humid, heavy summer morning pressed against the streets of East New York Street, the kind of neighborhood where the houses leaned close together and gossip traveled faster than the wind. Among the rows of modest homes sat one that looked no different from the rest. Chipped paint, cluttered porch, curtains drawn tight against the daylight. But behind those curtains, something unspeakable had been happening for months. When police stepped through the door that morning, they didn't yet know they were walking into one of the darkest crimes in American history. The air inside was stale, a mixture of cigarette smoke, dirt, and something far more disturbing, the faint metallic tang of decay. Children's toys lay scattered across the hallway floor, mixed with broken furniture and empty bottles. Down a narrow staircase in the dim basement light, they found her, a girl, thin, motionless, her pale skin marred by bruises and burns. She was 16. Her name was Sylvia Likens. The sight was beyond anything the officers had ever seen. Not rage, not impulse, but cruelty crafted over time. Around her, the basement was silent except for the dripping of a pipe overhead. It was the silence that told the story. The silence of a place where screams had once lived and then stopped. 3 months earlier, the scene had been very different. Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny had been left in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski, a thin, weary woman with sharp eyes and nicotine-stained fingers. Their parents, carnival workers trying to make a living, had trusted her to watch their daughters until the traveling season was over. At first, the arrangement seemed normal. The Baniszewski home was loud, filled with children, laughter, and noise. The Likens sisters shared chores, joined the neighbor, hood games, and even attended church with the family, but beneath the surface something dark was beginning to take shape. Gertrude was struggling sickly, poor, and bitter. The late payments from the Likens parents lit a quiet fury in her. Her authority over the house turned into something else, a hunger for control, a desire to dominate someone weaker. And in that house, Sylvia became the easiest target. It began subtly, a slap for a chore not done right, a harsh word about her looks, skipped meals when Gertrude was angry. But cruelty grows like mold, spreading quietly until it consumes everything around it. Within weeks, the house had changed. Gertrude's children began to mirror her moods. They watched how she punished Sylvia, and soon they were helping. The older ones encouraged the younger. The neighbors noticed less of Sylvia and more of the strange sounds that came from the Baniszewski home at night. Sylvia's sister Jenny grew pale and nervous, speaking less each day. She moved like someone walking through a dream, caught between fear and helplessness. The house had rules no one understood, but everyone obeyed. By September, the warmth of summer had faded, and so had the light in Sylvia's eyes. The once lively girl who smiled easily and told stories was now a shadow. The house that had promised safety had become her prison. The games outside continued, the laughter of neighborhood children, floating through open windows, but downstairs, in the dim light of the basement, another reality unfolded. Each passing day blurred into the next, the routine of silence, pain, and obedience. Sylvia stopped asking questions. She stopped expecting kindness. And while the rest of the neighborhood carried on the mailman whistling, the kids riding their bikes behind that closed door, a nightmare grew roots. On October 26th, the quiet broke. A neighbor called the police after he, airing something that didn't sound like any argument he'd ever heard before. Within hours, flashing lights filled East New York Street, their glow reflecting off the faded paint of Gertrude's house. The basement door creaked open. Inside lay the truth. Sylvia Likens was gone, but the horror she endured remained carved into every inch of that room. The police officers who entered would carry the image for the rest of their lives. What they didn't yet know was that this story, this unspeakable act, wasn't born of a stranger's rage or a sudden outburst of violence. It had grown quietly, inside a home filled with laughter, chores, and bedtime prayers. And the woman responsible was upstairs, lighting another cigarette, as if nothing had happened at all. Chapter 2. The Basement Confession. The house on East New York Street was surrounded by neighbors and flashing lights. Officers moved in and out, faces pale and voices low. Reporters had already gathered beyond the police tape, drawn by whispers of something terrible inside. But no one outside that basement could yet grasp the depth of what had been uncovered. Detectives worked through the night, documenting every inch of the Baniszewski home. The basement floor was covered in stains that no one wanted to name. A rusted bed frame sat against the wall, its springs twisted. Near it, they found scorched cloth, empty bottles, and crude markings scratched into the concrete. Each detail painted the same picture, a story of captivity, of suffering stretched across days and nights. Upstairs, the air was heavy with smoke and tension. Gertrude Baniszewski sat on a torn couch, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her hair clung to her temples with sweat. Her eyes, sunken and sharp, followed the officers as they moved. Around her, her children huddled together silent, watching. None of them cried. They had lived inside this nightmare for so long that horror had become ordinary. The questioning began quietly. One by one, the children and neighborhood kids were brought into another room. Some hesitated, others trembled. Stories that began to emerge didn't match at first, too fragmented, too impossible. But piece by piece, a clearer picture began to form. Sylvia had not died quickly. She had been kept in the basement for weeks. She had been denied food, forced to sleep on cold concrete, and subjected to acts that blurred the line between cruelty and madness. But perhaps the most chilling revelation wasn't what Gertrude had done herself, it was what she had encouraged others to do. Children, some barely teenagers, had joined in. They had mocked, laughed, and obeyed. The house had turned into something like a stage, where suffering was the performance and approval was the prize. The woman at the center of it all had directed every act with unnerving calm. In the days following Sylvia's death, the small neighborhood transformed. Neighbors who once waved at each other now avoided eye contact. Parents kept their children indoors. The local newspaper carried the story on its front page, describing it as an unspeakable case of neglect and brutality. But that word neglect barely touched the truth. Detective Henderson, who led the investigation, moved through the house like someone walking through a grave. Every object felt loaded with meaning. The broomstick, the empty plates, the locked door at the top of the stairs. He couldn't understand how so many people had been inside this house, and yet no one had stopped what was happening. The coroner's report confirmed the worst. Sylvia had endured prolonged starvation, multiple burns, and internal injuries consistent with repeated beatings. The words carved into her body weren't just cruelty, they were ritual, a message meant to destroy not just her body, but her dignity. Gertrude's calmness in custody unnerved everyone. She didn't protest, didn't shout, didn't weep. She spoke only when asked, her answers clipped and emotionless. She called. Lame, she had lost control, that it was discipline gone too far. But the stories from the children contradicted her. They described instructions, rules, routines. Every act had been planned, every punishment deliberate. In the days that followed, arrests multiplied. Not only Gertrude, but several of her own children and neighborhood youths were taken into custody. Reporters filled the courthouse, their flashbulbs flickering like lightning each time someone was led inside. The city of Indianapolis watched in disbelief as the details unfolded, an entire household bound together by silence and fear. The Likens family arrived to identify Sylvia's body. Her parents stood in stunned quiet, her mother gripping a handkerchief so tightly that it tore. The guilt in their faces told its own story. They had trusted someone to protect their daughters, and that trust had destroyed one of them. The investigation uncovered something even darker: pages of notes, scraps of paper, and letters Sylvia had written before her final days. Words that spoke of pain and confusion, of hope that someone might come for her. Letters that never made it out of that house. When the trial began, the courtroom was overflowing. The community wanted justice, but what they found instead was disbelief. The testimonies were almost too horrific to repeat. Young witnesses described things no child should ever have seen, let alone done. Through it all, Gertrude remained eerily composed, her expression unreadable. She was the quiet center of a storm, surrounded by evidence of her own creation. The prosecutor's closing argument would later describe her as a woman who built her own kingdom of cruelty. By the time the first verdicts were read, the courtroom was silent. Reporters wrote that no one clapped, no one spoke. There was only the sound of shuffling papers and the dull hum of the ceiling fan. The trial would mark the beginning of a long national reckoning, one that forced America to look at how cruelty could grow unnoticed, not in dark alleys or remote woods, but inside an ordinary home on an ordinary street. And yet, even with convictions secured, One question remained: how many had known, and how many had chosen not to see? Because behind every act of evil, there is always silence. Chapter 3. The trial that shook a nation. Winter settled over Indianapolis like a shroud. Snow collected on the courthouse steps as reporters huddled together, their notebooks trembling in the cold. Inside, the trial of Gertrude Baniszewski and her accomplices had become a national obsession. People across America read every detail, trying to make sense of how an entire neighborhood could have watched a child suffer and done nothing. The courtroom was crowded day after day. Journalists, neighbors, and even strangers who'd never met Sylvia came just to see the faces of those accused. Each testimony carved a deeper wound into the public's conscience. The jurors sat frozen, their expressions hollow as they listened to stories of what had happened in that small house on East New York Street. The prosecution laid out the evidence, methodically photographs of the basement, the medical examiner's findings, the objects used in Sylvia's torture. None of it was sensationalized. It didn't need to be. The facts alone were unbearable. Witness after witness spoke. Children described acts of cruelty that seemed impossible for their age. They spoke of nights when laughter echoed through the house while Sylvia lay suffering below. They spoke of a mother who encouraged it, who turned discipline into spectacle. Some broke down while testifying. Others stared blankly, their emotions long buried under guilt. Throughout it all, Gertrude sat motionless. Her face gave away nothing, no remorse, no fear. Occasionally she leaned toward her attorney, whispering in low tones, but she never looked toward Sylvia's family. When Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, took the stand, a courtroom fell silent. She was frail, her voice barely audible, but her words carried the weight of everything that had been lost. She recounted the months inside that house, the fear, the isolation, the helplessness. She spoke of her sister's gradual fading, of how every plea for mercy was met with indifference. By the time she finished, even the reporters stopped writing. The defense tried to argue that Gertrude was ill, that she had lost control of her mind. They painted her as a woman overwhelmed by poverty and responsibility, but no illness could explain the precision, the orchestration, the endurance of what had happened. This wasn't madness. It was cruelty performed in slow motion. When the verdict finally came, the crowd outside the courthouse pressed closer to the doors. Snow fell in thick flakes, muffling the noise of the city. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder. Her oldest daughter, Paula, and several of the neighborhood youths were convicted on lesser charges. Some wept as the sentences were read. Gertrude didn't. She simply lowered her head, her expression unchanged. As she was led away, Sylvia's parents sat together in silence. There were no tears left, only the hollow ache of something that could never be repaired. The justice system had done its part, but no sentence could balance what had been taken from them. In the months that followed, the story of Sylvia Likens became a warning one that reached far beyond Indiana. Lawmakers debated child protection laws. Schools began paying closer attention to signs of neglect. Neighbors became a little less willing to look away. The house where it all happened was eventually abandoned. Windows shattered, the paint peeled, and nature began reclaiming what was left. For years, no one wanted to live there. Locals said the silence around it felt heavier than air. Eventually, it was torn down, but some claimed that even the empty lot seemed to carry the weight of what had once stood there. For the surviving Likens family, life never returned to normal. Jenny carried her sister's memory quietly for decades. She rarely spoke of the house or the trial, yet every year on Sylvia's birthday, she visited a small headstone etched with her sister's name, the only place where the story finally ended. Time moved on, but the question remained: how could something so horrifying happen in plain sight? It wasn't a mystery of darkness lurking in strangers. It was a tragedy born of neglect, silence, and power left unchecked, a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes, it lives in ordinary houses, behind closed doors, in the hands of people who seem unremarkable. And even after justice was served, the story of Sylvia Likens stood as a mirror, showing what happens when humanity looks away. If you thought this story was disturbing, the next case goes even deeper, because sometimes the monsters we fear most aren't hiding in the dark. They're the ones we think we can trust. If this story shook you, make sure you hit like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Because what's coming next makes this one look almost merciful. Share this video with someone who thinks they've heard it all, and let them decide how far human cruelty can really go.